The day I inherited my grandfather's cabin was the day I started to lose my grip on reality. At least, that's how it feels looking back on it now. I never expected to inherit anything. I wasn't particularly close to my grandfather, and I hadn't visited him in years before he passed. He was always a quiet, reserved man, the kind who'd sit silently in a room full of people, seemingly deep in thought about something none of us could understand. As a kid, I used to wonder what it was that made him so distant. My parents used to tell me he'd lived a hard life, seen things during the war that changed him, but it was never something anyone talked about directly. He kept to himself, tucked away in that old cabin, far from town, where he'd lived alone since my grandmother passed. When I got the call from the lawyer about the will, I was honestly shocked. My parents had passed away years ago, and my grandfather had no other children or family to speak of. The lawyer's tone had been professional, but I could hear the slight hesitation in his voice as he read the terms of the inheritance. I was to receive my grandfather's cabin, along with all its contents, and a small sum of money. That was it. The cabin in the woods and whatever he left behind. I almost didn't go. It wasn't that I didn't care. I just didn't see myself needing or wanting an isolated old cabin. I lived in the city, my life was there, and the idea of spending time in a rural, empty house didn't appeal to me. But after a few sleepless nights and constant guilt tugging at the back of my mind, I decided to at least check it out. I owed my grandfather that much, right? The drive up to the cabin took longer than I remembered. The last time I'd been there was for my grandmother's funeral, almost 10 years ago. The road was as narrow and winding as it had been in my childhood memories, the tall trees lining the path like sentinels guarding some forgotten place. The deeper I went into the woods, the more distant the world behind me felt. My phone signal faded halfway up the dirt road, and by the time I arrived at the cabin, it was gone completely. The cabin itself hadn't changed much. It stood there, silent and small, surrounded by trees that seemed to press in on it from all sides. The wood was weathered, and the roof sagged slightly at the edges. A pile of logs, neatly stacked, sat beside the porch, just as I remembered. The windows were dark, the glass reflecting the cloudy sky above. I sat in the car for a few minutes before getting out, staring at the cabin like it was something from another life. Maybe it was. Everything about it felt out of place, frozen in time, untouched by the years that had passed. Finally, I stepped out of the car and made my way up to the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, and for a moment, I wondered if the whole thing would collapse beneath me. The key the lawyer had mailed me fit into the lock with a soft click, and the door swung open easily. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke, just like it always had. It was as though my grandfather had just stepped out for a walk and would be back any minute. His old armchair sat near the fireplace, a blanket draped over the back. A stack of books lay on the coffee table, their covers worn and edges yellowed with age. The kitchen was small but functional, with a few dishes still drying on the rack beside the sink. I wandered through the house, letting the memories of childhood visits wash over me. Everything felt so familiar and yet so distant, like walking through a dream where the details are just slightly off. I found myself pausing at the doorway to the bedroom, where the bed was still made, the blankets tucked neatly under the mattress. On the nightstand was an old alarm clock, its hands frozen at 11:47, and beside it, a photograph of my grandparents on their wedding day. I hadn't seen that picture in years. They looked so young, so happy. I sighed and rubbed the back of my neck, feeling the weight of the past settling heavily on my shoulders. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the place. Sell it, maybe, or let it sit here untouched like it had for so many years. But for now, I decided to stay the night. It was late, and the idea of driving back down that narrow road in the dark didn't appeal to me. I found the old generator in the shed out back, and after a few tries, I managed to get it running. The lights flickered on inside the cabin, casting long shadows across the walls, but it felt better than sitting in the dark. I spent the next hour or so unpacking a few things, tidying up the kitchen, and starting a fire in the fireplace. The crackling flames gave the room a warm glow, but the silence outside was deafening. There were no sounds of traffic, no distant hum of city life, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above me. I settled into my grandfather's armchair, a cup of tea in hand, and tried to relax. The fire was comforting, and for the first time in what felt like days, I started to feel a little less tense. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the fire wash over me, and began to doze off. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound, coming from somewhere in the cabin. At first, I thought it might be the wind, rattling the windows or a branch brushing against the side of the house. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone knocking softly over and over again. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath me. I stood, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the source. It was faint but steady, like someone tapping their fingers against the floorboards. For a moment, I considered leaving, just grabbing my bag and driving away without looking back. But I pushed the thought aside. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or something, scurrying under the cabin. That had to be it. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought with me and made my way toward the back door, where the entrance to the crawl space was located. The door creaked as I opened it, and the cold night air rushed in, chilling me to the bone. I shone the light down into the crawl space, half expecting to see something staring back at me. But there was nothing, just dirt and darkness. I stood there for a few minutes listening, but the tapping had stopped. The only sound now was the wind rustling the trees. With a nervous laugh, I shook my head and closed the door, locking it behind me. By the time I got back inside, the fire had died down, and the room was growing colder. I added a few more logs to the fireplace and sat back down, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. It was nothing, I told myself, just the house settling or the wind or an animal. Nothing to worry about. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about this place didn't feel right. And as I sat there, staring into the fire, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep much that night. After I'd convinced myself the tapping sound was nothing more than the house settling or an animal beneath the floor, I headed to bed. The mattress was old, the springs creaking beneath my weight, but I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Still, even as I lay there with my eyes closed, I couldn't get comfortable. My mind kept replaying that sound, the steady, deliberate tapping that seemed to come from under the floorboards. I kept telling myself it was just nerves. It had been a long day, after all, and being in the cabin for the first time in so many years brought back memories I hadn't expected. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the air in the cabin had thickened, become heavy, almost suffocating. The silence outside felt unnatural, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the occasional creak of the house, the wind outside, and the slow crackle of the dying fire. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard that tapping again, so faint it could have been imagined, but it was enough to jolt me awake. Eventually, sometime in the early morning hours, I must have fallen asleep. I woke with a start just as the first light of dawn was creeping through the window. The room was freezing. I glanced at the fireplace. Nothing but cold ash remained. The house was eerily quiet. No birds chirping outside, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I got up, rubbing my arms against the cold, and decided to make some coffee. The kitchen was small, just big enough for a stove, a tiny fridge, and a countertop cluttered with old knickknacks my grandparents had collected over the years. I found the coffee tin exactly where I remembered it being, in the cupboard above the sink. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I glanced out the kitchen window. The woods surrounding the cabin were dense, thick with trees that seemed to stretch on forever. The fog was low, clinging to the ground like a ghostly veil. There was something unsettling about the stillness of it all. I couldn't see any animals, no deer, no birds, nothing. It was as if the forest had gone silent overnight. I shook off the feeling and turned back to my coffee, trying to focus on something, anything else. After all, it had been years since I'd been out in a place like this. I was used to the city, the constant hum of life around me. Maybe I'd just forgotten how isolated it felt out here. The coffee was strong, bitter, but it warmed me up. I sat at the small kitchen table, trying to decide what to do next. I'd planned to stay at the cabin for a few days, just to sort through some of my grandfather's things. But now I wasn't so sure. The idea of spending more than one night here made my skin crawl. The strange thing was, I couldn't pinpoint exactly why I felt so uneasy. It wasn't just the tapping sound, though that had definitely gotten under my skin. It was the atmosphere of the place. Like the walls were holding onto something dark, something I didn't quite understand. After finishing my coffee, I decided to go outside and get some fresh air. I figured a walk in the woods might clear my head. I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, and the fog still hung low over the ground, but the woods were waking up now. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional distant caw of a crow. I walked down the narrow path that led into the trees, my feet crunching on the fallen leaves. The cabin quickly disappeared from view behind me, swallowed by the thick forest. For a while I just walked. The further I got from the cabin, the better I felt. The unease that had been gnawing at me began to fade, replaced by the calming sounds of the woods. Birds chirped overhead, and I spotted a few squirrels darting up the trees. I tried to lose myself in the simplicity of it, in the quiet beauty of nature. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was subtle at first, just a nagging thought in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite place. Then, about half an hour into the walk, I stopped. The woods were silent again. No birds, no wind, just the stillness, the kind that makes your heart beat a little faster, makes you feel like you're being watched. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the fog curling around the trunks and the bare branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I turned around and started back toward the cabin, a sudden urgency in my steps. I wasn't sure why, but I needed to get back. My heartbeat quickened, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something lurking in the fog. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my nerves were shot. I stood on the porch for a moment, catching my breath and telling myself I was being ridiculous. There was nothing out there, just the woods. But that didn't stop the prickling feeling on the back of my neck. like eyes were on me even now. Back inside, I busied myself with more mundane tasks, trying to distract my mind. I sorted through some of the books my grandfather had left behind, organizing them into neat stacks on the living room floor. I found a few old journals tucked away in a drawer, their pages filled with my grandfather's neat handwriting. Most of it seemed to be day-to-day notes, weather, gardening plans, mentions of trips into town. But as I flipped through the last journal, something caught my eye. Passage dated about 2 years ago. _ something's changed. The woods don't feel the same anymore. I hear things at night, things I can't explain. It's not the animals. It's something else. Something I can't see but can feel watching me. _ I paused, my fingers frozen on the page. My heart started to race again as I read the next line. _ the tapping has started again. I thought it had stopped after all these years, but it's back. I don't know why. I don't know what it wants. _ I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. The tapping, he'd heard it too. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Had my grandfather gone mad in his old age? Or was there something else? Something real? The cabin felt colder suddenly, the air heavy and oppressive. I stood up, pacing the room, my thoughts spinning out of control. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I grabbed my bag, stuffing it with clothes and essentials as quickly as I could. The tapping hadn't come back since last night, but the weight of the journal's words hung over me like a dark cloud. I didn't want to find out what it was. I didn't want to stay long enough to hear it again. As I reached for my keys, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. The tapping sound, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards, slow and deliberate. I stood there, frozen, listening as it continued. It was louder now, more insistent, like whatever was making it wanted my attention. For a moment, I considered running, just bolting out the door and not looking back. But something in me hesitated. Something in me needed to know. With shaking hands, I grabbed the flashlight and crouched down near the floor. The sound was coming from just beneath the living room, where the floorboards were old and uneven. I pressed my ear against the wood, my heart pounding in my chest. Tap, tap, tap. It was right below me. The tapping was steady, unnervingly rhythmic, as if it were part of some unseen mechanism just below the floorboards. For a long moment, I stayed crouched there, my ear pressed against the cold wood, listening to the sound that shouldn't have been possible. My brain scrambled for explanations, tree roots moving against the foundation, water pipes, but none of them made sense. Felt alive. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to walk out the door and never come back. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a mixture of fear and curiosity. Something about that sound was calling to me, pulling me in, daring me to uncover its source. I sat back on my heels, shining the flashlight across the floor. The old boards were worn with age, scuffed in places, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for the sound, persistent and maddening, coming from below. My hand trembled as I reached for the crowbar I'd found in the shed earlier, intending to pry up the floorboards. The logical part of my brain told me this was a terrible idea, but another part, a deeper, irrational part, needed to know what was under there. I slid the edge of the crowbar into the narrow gap between two boards and pried upward. The wood creaked, resisting for a moment before giving way with a loud snap. I lifted the board, revealing the darkness beneath. A thick layer of dust and cobwebs greeted me, and at first, it appeared to be nothing more than an empty crawl space. The flashlight beam swept across the dirt floor beneath the cabin, illuminating nothing unusual, just earth and stone. My breath came out in a relieved sigh, but then the tapping returned, louder this time, echoing from below. I froze. The sound was no longer a distant tapping. It was more deliberate, more forceful, like something hitting the wood from underneath. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I leaned over the opening, shining the flashlight into the crawl space again. That's when I noticed it. In the far corner, just beyond the reach of the light, something was there. A patch of ground that looked different. The earth was disturbed, as if it had been recently dug up and then covered back over. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. There was no reason for the soil to look like that, not unless someone had been under the cabin recently. The thought that someone or something could have been beneath the floorboards, undetected, sent a wave of nausea through me. I hesitated, my mind racing. I could cover the hole, leave, and pretend none of this ever happened. But I knew I wouldn't be able to live with the uncertainty. I had to know. My grandfather had heard the tapping too. He'd written about it, and I needed to find out what it was that had tormented him in his final years. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a small shovel from the shed outside. When I returned, I knelt by the opening in the floor, shining the flashlight over the disturbed ground one more time. My stomach churned with dread, but I pushed through it, digging into the soft soil. The smell hit me first. It was a wet, earthy smell, but beneath that was something else, something faintly rotten. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve as I kept digging, the dirt soft and loose beneath the surface. It didn't take long before the shovel hit something solid. Wood. I stopped, my chest tightening. Whatever was under the floor had been deliberately buried. I brushed away more dirt with my hands, revealing what looked like the edge of a wooden box or crate. It was old, the wood splintered and rotting, but it had been placed there carefully, hidden beneath the cabin. With trembling hands, I wedged the crowbar under the edge of the box and pried it open. The wood groaned in protest, and as the lid gave way, I dropped the crowbar, taking a step back. The box opened slowly, the hinges creaking. Inside, wrapped in layers of dirty fabric, was something small and oddly shaped. I pulled the cloth aside, revealing a doll. But it wasn't a doll in the traditional sense. This one was crudely made, its body formed from twisted bits of fabric and twine, its face an unsettling combination of cracked porcelain and hair. Real human hair woven into the twine that bound the figure. The eyes, black, shiny beads, stared up at me blankly, but there was something unnerving about the way they seemed to glint in the dim light. My stomach churned as I held the thing in my hands, my skin crawling with revulsion. The doll was damp, covered in dirt, but what disturbed me most was the sheer sense of malevolence that seemed to emanate from it. I wanted to drop it, to throw it back in the hole and cover it up, but I was transfixed. The craftsmanship, if you could call it that, was crude but deliberate. Someone had made this, and they had made it for a reason. I swallowed hard, setting the doll on the floor beside me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I just found. Why had this been buried beneath the cabin? And more importantly, why had my grandfather never mentioned it? As I sat there, staring at the doll, the tapping started again. Louder this time, but it wasn't coming from the floor anymore. It was coming from the walls. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The tapping moved, shifting from one wall to the next, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to encircle me. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing across the walls as I tried to follow the sound. It was everywhere. Above me, around me, inside the walls. Panic surged through me as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. My skin prickled with fear, my hands shaking uncontrollably. It felt like the cabin itself was alive, as though it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to uncover whatever had been hidden beneath the floor. I grabbed the doll, shoving it back into the hole, and hurriedly threw the dirt back over it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I slammed the floorboard back into place, my hands trembling as I hammered it down. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, I stayed there, on my hands and knees, my heart racing, waiting for the sound to start again. But it didn't. The cabin was still. The oppressive weight that had hung over me moments ago seemed to lift slightly, replaced by an eerie calm. I collapsed onto the floor, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I didn't know what to make of any of it. The tapping, the doll, the disturbed ground beneath the cabin. But one thing was clear. My grandfather had been hiding something dark. And whatever it was, it wasn't finished with me yet. The oppressive silence after the tapping stopped was almost worse than the noise itself. I sat there on the floor, panting, covered in dirt, my mind spinning. Every part of me wanted to believe it was over, that whatever strange energy had filled the cabin had dissipated the moment I buried the doll again. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I had seen enough horror movies, read enough strange stories to know when things were about to go from bad to worse. But this wasn't some story. This was real, and the truth of it was far worse than anything I could have imagined. My grandfather's journal had said the tapping had returned after all those years, but it hadn't said what he had done to stop it, or if he ever did. Couldn't stay there. The cabin had shifted from a place of eerie quiet to something far more menacing. Even with the floorboards back in place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The walls seemed to press in around me, and the air felt thick again, like something was waiting, watching. Without another thought, I grabbed my things and bolted for the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the lock, throwing it open and stepping outside into the cold night air. The fog had rolled back in, thicker now, curling around the trees like a living thing. The woods, which had once seemed so peaceful, now felt suffocating, ominous. But at least they were open, at least I could breathe out here. I stood on the porch for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to make sense of everything. The doll, the tapping, the strange markings in my grandfather's journal. It all pointed to something bigger, something more disturbing than just an old man's descent into madness. I had to leave. I had to get far away from the cabin, from whatever was inside it. But something stopped me, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something I hadn't thought about until now. The chest. In the corner of the crawl space just beyond where the doll had been buried, there had been something else. A chest, old and decayed, its edges just visible beneath the dirt. I hadn't noticed it until I started digging, but now the image of it was burned into my mind. My grandfather had hidden something else down there, something I hadn't uncovered yet. I should have left. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to drive away and never look back. But that same twisted curiosity that had driven me to dig up the doll pushed me back toward the cabin. I couldn't leave without knowing. Taking a deep breath, I turned back to the porch and stepped inside once more. The air inside was cold, and the smell of damp earth still lingered. I made my way back to the spot where I'd torn up the floorboards. My hands shook as I pried the boards up again, this time more quickly, less carefully. I tossed the pieces aside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness below. The chest was still there, just where I'd seen it, half buried in the dirt, its wood blackened with age and rot, but still intact. It was small, barely larger than a suitcase, but something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. I climbed down into the crawl space, my knees sinking into the soft earth as I pulled the chest free. It was heavier than it looked, the wood groaning as I dragged it into the light. There were no locks, no obvious signs of how to open it, but the lid was loose, and with a bit of effort I managed to pry it open. Inside was something that made my blood run cold. Bones. Not full skeletons, but fragments. Tiny, brittle bones, carefully wrapped in cloth, laid out in neat rows. I swallowed hard, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was looking at. These were human bones, small, delicate, like those of a child. There were at least a dozen of them, each wrapped carefully in faded fabric, their surfaces stained with time. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the chest, beneath the bones, was a bundle of papers. Old, yellowed, and brittle, but still legible. I pulled them free, my hands trembling as I unfolded the first one. It was a letter, underscore to whoever finds this. Underscore it began, underscore, I am sorry for what you've uncovered. I am sorry for what I have done. But I had no choice. Underscore. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. It was my grandfather's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. Underscore the doll. The tapping. It all started when I was a boy. My father found it buried in the woods, deep in the ground. He said it was a curse, something that had been left there long before our family came to this land. He thought he could control it, but he was wrong. The tapping, it never stops. It follows you, it gets into your mind. It drove my father mad. He tried to destroy it, but you can't destroy what it is. It's not just the doll. It's what's inside it. It's the thing that waits. Underscore. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I read the next line. Underscore the bones. They are sacrifices. Each time the tapping started, each time the doll was uncovered, it demanded more. My father gave in, and so did I. It was the only way to keep it quiet, the only way to keep it from taking more. Underscore. I dropped the letter, my stomach twisting in horror. My grandfather had known all along. He had known about the doll, about the tapping, about the bones. He had known, and he had fed it. My hands shook as I shoved the papers back into the chest, slamming the lid shut. I scrambled out of the crawl space, kicking the floorboards back into place as if that could somehow stop what I had unleashed. The tapping started again. This time it wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. It was loud, deafening, as if it were coming from all around me. The walls shook. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something heavy, something moving, something coming. I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to grab my things. I just bolted out the door, my feet pounding against the dirt as I raced toward my car. The tapping followed me, growing louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the narrow road, not daring to look back. The tapping never stopped. Even now, as I sit here, far away from the cabin, far away from those woods, I can still hear it. Faint, at first, but growing louder with each passing night. I've tried to drown it out with music, with noise, with anything that will keep it at bay. But nothing works. I know what it wants, and I know I can't run from it forever. The tapping is always there, just beneath the surface, waiting. And it's getting closer.